speaker in opposition of the motion is Dr. Louise Kettle. Dr. Kettle is an assistant professor at the University of Nottingham and an expert in British foreign and security policy, focusing on the Middle East. Her expertise has led her to regularly advise governments and the military. She's published widely, including Learning from the History of British Interventions in the Middle East, and contributes across media. Dr. Kettle, you have the ears of the House. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me. Today I stand firmly in opposition to the ideas that Western intervention in the Middle East is something that should be regretted, and hope to persuade you of the same. The proposition has already made clear that no geopolitical engagements, and certainly no military interventions, are without their complexities, their criticisms, their faults, and in some cases have indeed been complete disasters with terrible fallout. But it is far too binary and simplistic to reduce all Western intervention to the realm of regret. And military intervention is not the only form of intervention in this region. Indeed, the record of Western involvement in the region has also littered with positive outcomes and interventions that, despite their imperfections, have often provided a counterweight to tyranny, to terrorism, and instability.
On that point, which?
I'm sorry, could you elaborate?
Which Western interventions have brought stability, reduction in terrorism, reductions in children dying,
Thank you.
reductions in adults dying?
If you will let me continue, I will get to those points exactly. Thank you very much. Therefore, to argue that the Middle East would be better off without Western involvement not only wanders into the risky world of counterfactuals and parallel universes, but also ignores history, dismisses progress, and proposes the abandonment of populations in times of need. So to try to persuade you to vote nay, I am going to highlight 4 areas of successful Western intervention. For those realists in the room, I will think about security, stability, and counterterrorism. For those interested in the moral imperative, I will briefly touch upon humanitarian assistance and crisis response. For the ideological or value-driven of those of you in the room, I will briefly discuss protecting democracy, human rights, and international norms. And for those that still remain cynical, I will resort to good old-fashioned fear, the risks of not intervening, reiterating the point of information already raised. So, security and counterterrorism. The first benefit of Western intervention has been in security and counterterrorism. In a region that is plagued by the rise of extremist groups like Al-Qaeda and Daesh, Western intervention has been essential in containing and rolling back radical ideologies that pose a threat not only to regional peace, but to global security. Consider the rise of Islamic State in Iraq and Syria between 2014 and 2017. Without Western air power, intelligence, special operations support, the Islamic State would have expanded its caliphate and committed atrocities against countless civilians. Instead, the coalition has helped to play a decisive role in the liberation of key cities like Mosul and Raqqa. This intervention prevented genocide. It halted the enslavement of minority populations such as the Yazidis, and it dismantled an international terrorist network that inspired attacks in Paris, Brussels, and beyond. Moreover, Western military partnerships with regional allies have strengthened counterterrorism capabilities. Training programs, such as those for the Iraqi security forces and the Kurdish Peshmerga, help train local governments to stand up to extremism independently. Western surveillance, drone technology, intelligence sharing have dismantled terror cells and foiled plots before they could materialize. Thus, Western intervention has not only benefited the region, but created a safer international environment, and continues to do so through the global coalition of 89 partners working to defeat Daesh. Argumentation.
That particular argument you're making that the West has been a part in degraded terrorism only works if you start at a very particular point of time to convene different narratives. For instance, if you just go back a few decades, couldn't we argue that the Western intervention played a huge part in the rise of ISIS and Al-Qaeda and so on?
I'm sorry, I didn't catch the last bit, but please bear with me as I try to make some progress into this. It's worth noting that the region cannot prosper without a level of security and stability. For example, Saudi Arabia Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman realised this some time ago, and I would argue perhaps cynically it's why he's looking to diversify his economy. He's also looking to increase peace in the region. Second point, if we move away from that, to think about humanitarian assistance and crisis response. Over time, the Middle East has experienced devastating humanitarian crises. Critics may argue that Western actions sometimes contribute to this displacement, which is true, but it does also not negate existence of civil wars, authoritarian regimes, internal sectarian divisions, and natural disasters that also cause challenges, and where Western intervention has been a lifeline for millions. Over time, the West has contributed billions of aid to refugees, displaced people, and to help rebuild infrastructure, even in places where there's conflict with its current leadership. A good example here is Yemen, where there is one of the world's most severe humanitarian crises, as millions of Yemenis have faced famine and disease. I must make some progress, I'm afraid. Western nations, include the United States and the United Kingdom, have provided substantial humanitarian aid to Yemen, focusing on food security, healthcare, and sanitation. And Western organisations such as USAID, the International Rescue Committee, Médecins Sans Frontières, and countless NGOs funded by Western nations provide essential healthcare, education, and emergency response services in countries like Yemen, Lebanon, and Palestine. Let me move on now to the protection of democracy, human rights, and international norms. While Western efforts to promote democracy in the Middle East have certainly had mixed results, to underestimate it, they remain an essential force for good in challenging authoritarianism, advocating human rights, and protecting international norms. This does not always have to be militarily. Western embassies and civil society organisations work to protect journalists, support gender equality and minorities, fund free media platforms in the region. They provide scholarships for students, training for human rights defenders, platforms for political dialogue. They have used diplomatic interventions to highlight abuses and calls for reform, such as after the murder of Jamal Khashoggi and the crackdown of Iranian protesters. They have offered resettlement programs and taken part in military operations to protect vulnerable people. In the region, this has included establishment of no-fly zones in Libya in 2011 as part of the responsibility to protect, and Iraq throughout the 1990s to protect the Kurds in the north and the Shia in the south. Were these perfect? No. Are they the subject of criticism, of selectivity, and unintended consequences? Yes. Are there lessons to be learned? 100%. Many sobering lessons. But these are not arguments against intervention itself, but rather arguments for better intervention. More thoughtful planning, more local engagement, and clearer post-conflict strategies. Moreover, what is the alternative? The alternative is non-intervention. We are probably all aware of the disastrous consequences of the frequently referenced impact of non-intervention in Rwanda in 1994, where genocide was watched by the West from afar. But non-intervention has led to significant civilian suffering in places in the Middle East too. In Syria, Western hesitation in the early years of the Arab Spring allowed the Assad regime to use chemical weapons and arguably led to hundreds of thousands of deaths and millions displaced. The destabilization has a huge knock-on effect on the wider region as refugees flood into Iraq, Turkey, and Lebanon. Moreover, the non-intervention of the West left space. It left a vacuum for Russian and Iranian entrenchment. And non-intervention after the use of chemical weapons against civilians only further emboldened Russia. In fact, not intervening can lead to power vacuums created by failing states and a loss of geopolitical influence, while the failure to uphold international laws and norms erodes Western credibility and emboldens Western competitors. In conclusion, I'm afraid, Western intervention has been far from perfect and the proposition has ably established some cases where it's been truly disastrous. But it is not all to be regretted. Instead, there is also true that Western intervention has thwarted terrorist networks, saved lives, rebuilt economies, and offered hope to those living under oppression. Should the West regret coming to protect Jordan upon the King's request in 1958, or Kuwait upon request days after its independence in 1961? Should it regret creating a coalition of 42 countries to restore the independence of Kuwait after annexation by Iraq in 1990, or fighting against the brutal regime of Daesh? Should it regret trying to alleviate famine in Yemen, or funding development projects to support small business development, job creation, women's economic empowerment in Jordan? Should it regret initiatives to improve Egypt's agricultural productivity or healthcare infrastructure projects in Palestine and Lebanon? Should it say and do nothing over the murder of a journalist or the killing of non-violent protesters? My answer to all of these would be no. And my question to you is, what would have happened if there had been no intervention at all? The people of the Middle East deserve engagement, support, and solidarity from the international community, and especially when they ask for it. This is why this House should not regret Western intervention in the Middle East. Thank you.